Here we are in Page Springs, Arizona. It is April 28th. It's actually my brother Randy's birthday, and Dad is here visiting, and we're going to have a little chat about the family food packing business. And right here in my hands I have Baxter's Finest Fancy Quality Vacuum Packed Whole Kernel Golden Sweet Corn. And Dad's going to give us a little history on the development of the packing company that resulted in Baxter's Finest, and then ultimately went on to Oregon and Hawaii and all kinds of good stuff. So, Dad.
Well, you want me to talk to you or to him?
I would talk to the camera.
Okay.
And start, please, with James Finney Baxter and his development of the Portland Packing Company and where it went from there.
Well, the interesting thing starts before that, and that is when James Finney and one other person,
Davis?
It may have been Davis, secured a patent on preserving corn in a tin. And that was around the time of the Civil War. And so the patent was issued to them, and later on a company in Maryland infringed it. And James Finney's partner wanted to sue them. And James Finney said that he did not think the patent would hold up, and therefore he wanted out. And I'm not sure whether he sold out or what he did, but anyway, he disengaged, as I understand it, from the suit. The suit was brought, it went to the Supreme Court, and it lost. For a long time in the office in Brunswick, the record of that Supreme Court trial was in a big volume in a closet by my father's desk, and I never read it or looked into it, but it was there. And when the office was broken up and no longer part of, I think it was, my father was the only one left there. Where it went, I don't know. Somebody probably has it somewhere, but you might ask Rupee sometime if he knows anything about it. But that part's interesting. And so James Finney and you think Davis from Portland Packing Company? I didn't know that, but at least Portland Packing Company was populated by James Finney's son, Clinton, and Hartley, my grandfather, and one or two others. I'm not sure which ones they were. And my grandfather was reputedly a hypochondriac.
And your grandfather's name was?
Hartley.
Hartley Cone, right?
Hartley C. Baxter, right. Cone. And Cone was the one of the names of my great-grandfather's wives or something. But anyway, he was continually away from the company. And his other partners, or whatever they were, I guess probably it was a partnership, objected to his receiving his share of the profits when he wasn't there a lot of the time. And that was after, I guess, some period of time. But anyway, he, of course, objected to that seriously, and as a result, he left the company and formed his own company. In the meantime, he had married my grandmother, who was a Lincoln, and who lived in Brunswick. So he moved to Brunswick and founded his company around 1890, I believe. And he subsequently took in one brother, which I believe was my Uncle Rupert, his brother Rupert. And their company was a partnership called A.C. Baxter and Brother, period. And then they took in later the other brother, James Finney Jr. So it was the three original brothers that ran the company. And during that time there was some canning in Nova Scotia, principally, I think of lobster. And my father used to go up there. He used to tell me about Little Brador, which is a lake in Nova Scotia that I've been around. And I guess that was subsequently continued. But anyway, their principal business was canning corn. And they built built small plants in various places that they thought were agriculturally advantageous, and there were a lot of them. Particularly, there were about 4 in the Connecticut River Valley, in Westminster, Vermont, Windsor, I think White River Junction, and Claremont. And then there were others. There was one in St. Albans, Maine, Heartland, Maine. Well, St. Albans, Maine was the first one, and there was one even in Brunswick, and they were essentially lean-tos or shacks with husking machines in them and cutting machines, and then fillers and retorts. And that was because they only operated about a month out of the year, so there was no sense of building a fancy plant, and to that degree they were smart. They just put them together, and so they would go out in the spring and sign up farmers to grow the corn, give them the seed. Then they would go back and they would have a plant manager then that would look after the farmers and make sure the crops were growing properly. And they would sell the crop. They would travel and sell the crop, what they can, I think during the summer. And then they would all go out to different plants. And incidentally, there was one in Wapello, Iowa, eventually anyway. And so-called put up the pack, get it in storage, and go back and deliver the product during the winter. But mostly my grandfather went to Florida, St. Petersburg, in his yacht. And then, as time went on, this was in the teens, each one of the senior partners took in a junior partner. In the case of my grandfather, it was my father. In the case of Uncle Jim, it was Webster Brown, who married his daughter Nellie and subsequently divorced. And in the case of Uncle Rupert, it was Bruce White, who married his daughter Mary White, Uncle Rupert's daughter, Mary White.
Mary Baxter, who became Mary White.
Yeah, Mary Baxter White.
And your father's name was?
John Baxter. So it came along to 1920, and I think probably under my father's direction, they decided that they could add more products. So they added canned peas, and subsequently they added string beans and what we call shell beans, which was a so-called flat bean allowed to go to seed, and was therefore dried and then soaked and canned. And they also made a succotash, which was so-called Indian type succotash, which was cream-style corn and the cranberry beans, or shell beans, which were red in color. So that went on, pretty much the same thing. Webster Brown was the sales manager, Bruce was the treasurer and accountant, and my father was sort of the operations manager. And they all went to various plants in the summer to put up the packs. Bruce ran the offices, Webster looked after the crops, and my father looked after running the plant. I did forget to, as an aside, I did forget to mention that my grandfather in the 20s and early 30s went to Westminster, Vermont to put up that pack, that and at Windsor. And he took the family, my grandmother, and their cook, Sadie Johnson. And I went for 2 years. And I was, I suppose, 10 or 11 at that point. And I went with them and struck up a friendship with a man named Bat Canary. And Bat Canary was the local blacksmith and had a horse named Dick and several different styles of wagons, horse-drawn wagons. And we picked up freight at the station and delivered it. We picked up garbage and took it to the dump, and did various jobs like that. And I really, really greatly enjoyed that. That was in Walpole, New Hampshire. And I have a couple of pictures to this date of myself riding in one of the wagons, driving Dick. Anyway, that's a really rather fond memory. Among other things, when we went to the dump, they grew tobacco in the Connecticut River Valley, and they had houses with slats on them that dried the tobacco leaf. And I used to get dried tobacco leaf out of there and take it home and wrap it in newspaper so I could smoke it, much to my grandmother's and everybody else's horror. But, and it didn't work at all. It just didn't work. But it was a pretty good idea. So anyway, one thing we did do during the 30s was to create minted canned peas, because that was what the British ate. They ate peas with mint in them to go with their lamb. And so we canned peas first with a mint leaf in every can, and subsequently with mint extract in the cans. And we had a monopoly on the sales of canned peas in England for a long time, and my father liked to do this. No, Uncle Rupert was the first one to do this sales contact on that, and subsequently my father did. And he was very much of an Anglophobe anyway, so he really enjoyed it, and he went back and forth on the Normandy and the Queen Mary, and he had struck up some friendships there, particularly through our broker named Tilney, who was in the House of Lords. And Alice and I visited them once when we were in London. And as time went on to try to expand the line, they canned beets and carrots. And then subsequently, because it was seasonal and they desperately wanted a year-round operation of some kind, they started to can potatoes, because potatoes in Maine were harvested in the fall and stored all winter, and therefore were available. And they canned sliced potatoes, diced potatoes, and whole potatoes. And the whole potatoes, of course, were the small, round, small Katahdin potatoes that were called size B.
Katahdin potatoes?
Katahdin potatoes, yes. And so that went on for a while, and they tried making potato starch, which they could do off season, which was to be made out of potato culls, potatoes that couldn't go to market, but there weren't enough of them to make that work, so they canned potatoes in the starch plant, which was a plant built across the way from the vegetable canning plant. And then all through that period, from the time I was about 15 till I was graduated from college, I worked at the plants all summer, in the warehouse, out in the field, all over the place. So I worked on the floor with the guys, and seldom saw my father or the other people. And so that were very interesting times. I stayed at various rooming houses in the town of Hartland, and all this was at Hartland. I don't know if I mentioned that.
No, you didn't.
The first plant in that area was in St. Albans, which was about 7 miles from Hartland. But when they decided to expand, the St. Albans plant was not located well enough for expansion, so they moved to Hartland and built it by a railroad siding. Anyway, I must say the summers in Hartland were pretty wild. They, for a lot of the jobs in the offices around, they hired guys from Bowdoin College, and they were all from the Delta Kappa Epsilon chapter, because everybody, my grandfather, my father, everybody was a Deke, so we hired Dekes. And so they were all 18 to 22 years old, and then experimental part of life, needless to say. And that was in a period when Prohibition had just ended, and we all made the most of that.
How old were you at that time?
Well, I was 15, going on up.
So what did you boys do?
Oh, we just had a really wild time.
Rip-roaring good time?
Yes.
Like what constituted a wild time?
Oh, see, the plant had no set working hours, so anytime we got out of work, we just took off and went either to the local saloons. At that point, there was a country dance within 25 miles of Heartland every single night, including Sunday. So we attended those.
Were there girls at these dances?
Oh, well, what's that's not girls? Yes, there were girls at the dances. So anyway, come World War II, my father, who was very well known in the canning industry and had been president of the National Canners Association, was picked by Donald Nelson, who was head of the War Production Board, to head up the procurement of processed vegetables. So he went to Washington and proceeded to do the best he could to supply the Army with canned vegetables, and there was a need for dehydrated vegetables. There were dehydrated vegetables, potatoes, potatoes, in World War I, but at that time in World War I they did not know about the science of dehydration, so they did not inactivate the enzymes, and they stayed alive in the dry product and quite quickly destroyed it. So dehydrated potatoes had a very, very bad name subsequent to World War I by all the soldiers that came back. But anyway, the Army needed dehydrated potatoes, and there had been enough work done by the Western Regional Research Laboratory of the Department of Agriculture to determine what was needed to make the dehydrated potatoes survive. And that was merely to steam kill the enzymes. So nobody wanted to supply. There were some dehydrated potatoes being made in Idaho at the time, principally by the Simplot Company, but nobody wanted to expand that. So my father said, all right, my company will. And so we took on the responsibility to provide dehydrated potatoes for the Army. The interesting thing about that was that all the dehydrated potatoes being made at that time were made either in cabinets, in which trays were loaded, but the cabinets, the doors were closed and the wind was blown up through them and down through them, and then the trays were taken out and dumped. Or they were spread on trays and put in vertical carts on shelves and put in a tunnel. And each time a cart was pushed into the tunnel, it pushed one out the other end. And that was generally, well, there was parallel flow air and counterflow air. And then the trays were taken off the dollies that they were on and dumped and so forth and so on. But that obviously was a lot of very serious handwork and very expensive. So my father and the partners decided that we should do continuous belt dehydration. It had never been done. And Webster Brown, of all people, was the guy who was assigned the job of finding out how to do that. And somehow or other, I don't know how, he conducted the Schwartz Company in Philadelphia who was a tobacco dryer and dried tobaccos on continuous belts. And so we contracted with them to build a continuous belt dehydrator. In those days there was no steel available, so it was built out of cypress wood. It was about 4 or 5 feet wide and 90 feet long. And it had 2 stations, one type of air treatment, and then it dumped onto, which took out the majority of the water, and then dumped on, and that was in a very thin layer, and then was dumped onto another belt that was going much slower, so the layer was much deeper, and that was because it took quite a bit of time to get the last bit of water out to get the potatoes down to 6% moisture. Then we put an addition on the starch plant, and that's where the continuous belt dehydrator was installed. It was the first of its kind, and to this day it's still, the concept and the dryers are still being used, although of course ours is long gone. But the whole technique has survived. I was assigned the job of getting that installed and up and running. And I had an Army deferment to do that.
That's how you got out of the Army?
Well, I went, as soon as I get the job done, I went in the Army. But anyway, so I spent most of my time, I was married by then, and commuting to Brunswick, to Hartland from Brunswick. There was a guy named Brightmeyer who was in charge of the Schwartz Company's project. And he and I worked together to get this belt dehydrator installed. And we ran into various problems, but we got them all solved and got it up and running. And it involved, of course, peeling the potatoes. And we had an inventor named O.P. Pearson who invented what was called a steam peeler. Up until then, all potatoes, and all the potatoes in the West, where they were being dehydrated, were peeled in what we call abrasive peelers. Some were pots and some were continuous. But what that meant was that the potatoes were thrown against either rotating drums that were lined with an abrasive of some kind, or rotating rollers that were covered with an abrasive. But what it meant was there was not much control on how much skin you took off and how much meat you took, and of course it wore off all the knobs, dents, and every irregularity in the potato. And the steam peeler that OP invented and got a patent on, and which is still being used today only as a continuous rather than a batch, which his was, gave the batch of potatoes a very high pressure, instantaneous steam cook. And that cooked just a layer or two of cells under the potato, and then went through spray washers which knocked the skin off. And so the yield of input of potatoes to output of potatoes was much higher than with the abrasive peelers. So those were two very pioneering things that we did. The third thing that we did, though there were really three things, because potatoes, of course, had defects in them. Pieces of skin, maybe little black marks, eyes, and so forth, which historically had all been cut out, went over a table with like 50 or 60 women sitting at a moving belt, 30 on each side, picking up potatoes and with special little knives cutting out the defects. And I thought there had to be a better way of doing that. And I was aware at the time of electric eye sorting of dry beans. So I went to the electric eye sorting company, and they had that adapted to potatoes, because what we were drying was potato cubes, generally about either a 1/4 inch square or 3/8 inch square. So instead of using all those women on the belt to cut out the defects, we ran them through electric eyes, which ejected the squares which had defects on them. So that was that. And
can we stop at that point?